Welcome to this week's class in Chassidus. This week we're learning a beautiful, powerful Chassidic discourse from the Rebbe. The name of the Chassidic discourse is called Vayechulu Hashemayim. The Rebbe said this Chassidic discourse in Shabbos Parshas Bereshis, which is also Mevorchim HaChodesh Mar Cheshvan, when you bless the month of Mar Cheshvan, in the year Tavshin Lamed Gimel. And the Rebbe said this Chassidic discourse exactly 49 years ago. So the Chassidic discourse is based on the verse in this week's Torah portion where it says, Vayechulu Hashemayim va'aretz v'chol tzvam. Hashem finished the creation of heaven and earth and everything that was part of the creation. So the Medrash Rabbah on this verse says, and he quotes from Psalms, where King David says, L'chol tichla re'isi kates, rechava mitzvah yisecha miyoid. What does that mean? For everything I've seen an end and a limit and a time frame, which is referring to heaven and earth. Heaven and earth have a time frame, have a limit to it. Besides one thing that does not have a limit. What is that? That is Torah. Why do we know Torah doesn't have a limit? Because it says, Arucha mi'eretz midah. It's much longer from being able to create a quantifiable limit to Torah. That's what the Medrash says. So again, to recap, the Medrash is saying is that heaven and earth have a limit. Torah is limitless. So the Rebbe asks a simple question. What are we saying? We're saying is that heaven and earth have a limit. But the fact is we know that when Hashem created heaven and earth, you have within heaven and earth drawing in the powerful infinite light of Hashem. Ein Sof is in the world. And Ein Sof we know has no limit. And we know not only is there Ein Sof in the world, you also have the attribute of Ratzain, the power of Ratzain. And the power of Ratzain, Hashem wanted to create the world. And we know, for example, it says in the beginning of the Torah portion, Bereshis bara, in the beginning Hashem created. And if you look into the Targum Onkelos translates B'kadmin bra. Where what does that mean? Kadmin the first. It's referring to the attribute of Ratzain. Ratzain is a kadmoin. It's the first of the spheroids. And we know Ratzain is infinite. So since Ratzain for the world is infinite, so why does the Medrash say that the world is finite and Torah is infinite? The world technically also has a component that's infinite. And the Rebbe adds as follows, and he says like this. In other words, how do we know that the heaven and earth is finite? So the Medrash is basing it on the fact that the verse, when it refers to Hashem finished creating the world, is Vayechulu. Hashem finished creating heaven and earth. And Vayechulu is an expression of limitless. It's limited. It's limited. It has a finite component to it. But the fact is, we know the Rebbe says, Vayechulu also has another translation. What's the other translation of Vayechulu? It's from the expression of Tainug. Tainug means a deep pleasure. It's in the sphere, it's part of Keser. It's the higher level of Keser. It's actually higher than Ratzain. In other words, that in heaven and earth, Vayechulu, Hashem drew in Tainug. So if that's the case, why are we saying that heaven and earth have a finite existence? You have in there Ratzain, you have in there Tainug, you have in there Ein Sof. So seemingly heaven and earth is also infinite. Not only that, to take it a step further, the Rebbe explains like this. We know Vayechulu Hashemayim, Hashem finished creating the heaven and the earth. What is that connected to? It's connected to Shabbos. But we know in reference to Shabbos, there's two levels. There's one level of Shabbos, where Shabbos we know is the seventh day of the week. And it actually includes within it also the eighth, which hovers over it, which is referring to the level of Bina. So one hand, Shabbos is the seventh day, and it's connected to the eighth. It's the eighth which hovers over it, and connected to the sphere of Bina. That's on one level. On the other hand, we know that Shabbos is connected to Tainug, deep pleasure. Like for example, it says, we say it in the prayers, Chemdas Yomim Oisei Karasa. We call Shabbos Chemda, which is Tainug. In other words, what sphere is that? That's referring to the sphere of Atik. So on one hand, Shabbos is connected to Bina, and the other hand, Shabbos is connected to what? To Atik. Now, what's the difference between Bina and Atik practically in our case? So generally speaking, the seven midos, the seven attributes, and also Bina, the sphere of Bina, are limited, are finite spheres. In other words, why? Because Bina is connected to the six midos, from Chesed, Gvuras to Paris, and that's a Chod Yisoid, which is also finite. However, Atik, we know, is higher than Ishtalshalos. So we see that Shabbos has two components. On one hand, it's connected to finite, which is Bina and the six Midos, and also it's connected to what? The idea of Tainug. Now, so since Vayechulu Hashemayim V'Aretz is connected to both components. On one hand, yes, it's Bina and the six Midos, but on the other hand, it's also connected to Atik, it's connected to Tainug. So why does the Medrash say, blanket statement, that Shemayim V'Aretz has a finite component to it? Maybe it has a finite component also, but it also has an infinite component. So Rebbe is going to explain this with an introduction. We know, for example, that there's something which, with the Spherois, there's Seichel, there's intellect, Chachma Bina Das, and then there's the Keser, the crown, which in there you have Tainig and Ratzon. So we're going to focus in right now on two components of the Spherois. The component of intellect, Seichel, and we're going to focus in on the component of Ratzon, will. Now, Seichel, intellect, is its independent existence from the soul. In other words, let's say you have an intellectual idea, and you come up with the idea, the soul doesn't have to be into it once it's defined. It's not a soul thing. In other words, intellect is a calculated intellectual equation. So after you intellectually come up with an idea, you can write it up, you can put it on the table, and you can walk away. You're not necessarily connected to it. So intellect exists independent from the person. On the other hand, Ratzon. What is Ratzon? What means you want? So the essence is the wanting of the soul. And as the soul is invested in the wanting. In other words, like this, when it comes to wanting, it's just an expression of the soul. When it comes to intellect, it's a factual 1 + 1 is 2. It doesn't have to do with the soul. It's not connected to the soul per se. So because intellect is independent, and on the other hand, Ratzon is really an expression of the soul, that's why Ratzon is called Bli Gvul. It doesn't have a limit. Ein Sof. There's no end to it. Why? Because what is Ratzon? It's actually drawing in from the essence. So that applies to us as human beings and also as to Hashem. In other words, intellect is finite. It's an intellectual thing disconnected from the soul. But since Ratzon is connected to the soul and it's drawn out from the soul, it's drawn out from the essence, so it's infinite. Now, so you see again, we have intellect and Ratzon. Intellect is independent, it's finite. Ratzon, on the other hand, it's infinite because it's coming from the essence of the soul. Now, but now there it says there's two types of levels of Ratzon. Let's look at Hashem. Hashem had a want. He wanted to create the world, and he wanted for it to be Torah and mitzvos, and we should learn Torah and do mitzvos. Now, the wanting that Hashem wanted to create the world, the Ratzon, the will that Hashem had to create the world, is also drawing out technically from the essence of Hashem. However, even though it's coming, because Ratzon always comes from the essence of Hashem. But on the other hand, the will, the Ratzon that Hashem had to create the world, has a finite existence to it. Why? Because the source of the Ratzon is also finite. As we know, for example, there's the Ma'or, there's the source of light, and then there's the ray. So the Ratzon, the will to create the world, doesn't come from the Ma'or, from the source of life itself, but it comes from a shine, from a ziv and a ara, from a shine, from the glow, but not from the deepest depths of the essence. So the will, the Ratzon for the world, comes from an external place. So because it comes from an external place, the will to create the world is in a lower level, and therefore the world is finite. However, when it comes to the will, the Ratzon that Hashem had for Torah and mitzvahs, that's coming from the essence of Hashem himself, which is not limited to any finite calculation. So you have with the will for Torah and mitzvahs comes from Atzmos, from the essence of Hashem, not from the external part, like when it comes to creation of the world. And there it brings actually from the Zohar. The Zohar says, on the verse in the Torah when it says, "V'yikchu li," you should take to me. So li means you should take it to me. But li means, the Zohar says, li, me, myself. In other words, when you learn Torah, you're taking me, Hashem. You're taking the essence of Hashem. So when we sit and learn Torah, we study Torah, we meditate in Torah, we're taking what? We're not taking the ray, an external part of Hashem. We're taking the essence of Hashem. Like, for example, it's explained in other places where it says in the Ten Commandments, the opening commandment, Anoichi Hashem Elokecha. What does that mean, Anoichi? I. Not Hashem is, we know the name of Hashem. Elokecha is another name of Hashem. Anoichi is the essence of Hashem. And what is Anoichi referring to? The part of Hashem which is not quantified in a description or any other details. It's higher than any name. So Anoichi Hashem Elokecha, Anoichi, the essence of Hashem is in the Torah. So when it comes to Torah and mitzvos, you have the essence of Hashem. So again, to recap, there's the Ratzain, the will Hashem had to create the world, that comes from Chitzonius Ratzain. It comes from a ray, and therefore the world is finite. Torah and mitzvos comes from the Ratzain, the essence of Hashem, and therefore Torah and mitzvos are infinite. Now, so you have the world, which comes from finite, and Torah and mitzvos, which is infinite. And here comes the magic. Here comes the powerful gift. However, when we Jewish people learn Torah and preserve the mitzvahs, then we take that powerful Ratzon, that powerful will of Hashem, which we said is connected to the Atzmi, the essence of Hashem, of Torah mitzvahs, and we infuse it in the world. Powerful. Again, it's to recap so we can go forward and get it. The Ratzon, the will for Hashem to create the world, is Chitzonius Ratzon. It comes from a ray. So therefore the world is finite. The will, the Ratzon for Torah mitzvahs is infinite. And therefore Torah mitzvahs is infinite. When we go along and we learn Torah while we're in this world, we do mitzvahs in this world, we're fusing and we're taking from the infinite essence of Hashem, which is normally exists only in Torah mitzvahs, and we're bringing it into the world. Like we explained before, there's Bina, which is finite, and there's Atik, which is infinite. And the goal is to reveal Atik in Bina. Even though Bina is finite, you want to reveal Atik in Bina. In other words, Bina by itself, it says, Bina's aim reivetzes ala afroichim. It's the mother hovering over the children, which is referring, what are the children of Bina? The 6 midos. And the 6 midos, we know, they're finite, they're limited. 6 sides. But when we do our spiritual work, then we draw into Bina from its source. And the source of Bina is the pnimius, the internal part of Atik. As we know the expression in Zohar, pnimius Bina, pnimius Atik. What's the source of the internal part of Bina? Pnimius Atik. So when we learn Torah in the mitzvahs, we're drawing in Atik into Bina. Up until the point when Atik gets revealed, we're in Bina. Just like the Rebbe says, this is exactly what happens in Rosh Hashanah. What happened in Rosh Hashanah? In other words, what happens in Rosh Hashanah? We draw in Tainug, which is the infinite part, the essence of the infinite part of Tainug, which is higher. There's different levels in Tainug and pleasure. There's a Tainug that comes from different things. Tainug, which is felt, that's a lower level of Tainug. But the highest level of Tainug, called Tainug HaPashut, Tainug Atzmi, and the goal of Rosh Hashanah is to take that powerful Tainug, the deep, pure Tainug, and bring it down into the world, what? By blowing shofar in Rosh Hashanah. So based on this, the Rebbe explains very powerful, and he says like this. Vayechulu hashamayim va'aretz v'chol tzva'am. What does that mean? Vayechulu, the way the Medrash initially translated it was an end. But vayechulu actually means an expression of tainug, deep pleasure. What does that mean? But on the other hand, we know that only applies to Torah mitzvahs. So vayechulu hashamayim va'aretz, which means tainug, which is really disconnected, not connected to the earth and the heaven. But when we do our spiritual work, then by Yechulu, then we draw in Tainug into Shemayim and Aretz, into the heaven and the earth, in the physical heaven and earth. And just like the first human being, Adam Arishan, the first man, what happened on the 6th day of creation, and that's actually when by Yechulu was said, so he called everyone together and he said, Boyu nishtachva v'nichra b'nivrcha lefnei Hashem Aseinu. Let's bow down, let's prostrate, and let's bless the infinite God that made us. So up until Adam HaRishon, there was the world, and there was God. Adam HaRishon says, no, let's connect God to the world. Let's bring in blessings into the physical world. And that's why it says, whoever says Vayichulu, which again, now we know the insight of Vayichulu, taking Tainug and bringing it down to the world, you become a partner with Hashem. You become a partner with Hashem. In what? In the creation of the world. Because until you say Vayichulu, the world is a physical world. And when you say Vayichulu, you draw down Tainug into this world, now you become a partner with Hashem. You're infusing the world with God and godliness, the infinite God and godliness. Why? Because when you say Vayichulu, which means practically you're drawing in Tainug, the highest level of Tainug, into the world, so the person makes Shamayim Chadashim ve'eretz Chadasha. You make a new heaven, so to speak, and a new earth, one that's infused with the infinite part of Hashem, which is higher than the heaven and earth on its own. Because the heaven on earth on its own is finite. On the other hand, when we say Vayichulu, we draw in the infinite part into the world. And the Rebbe quotes from the Talmud, where the Talmud says that G'doilim Maaseh Tzadikim and Maaseh Shemayim Aretz, that the acts of tzaddikim, it means people that bring godliness into the world, is greater than the actual creation of the world. Why? Because when a tzaddik goes ahead and makes a blessing and learns Torah and does mitzvos, what you do then is you draw down Tainug into the creation of the world. And that's why we know that what was the old purpose and why did Hashem create the world? Because Hashem wanted Hashem wanted a dwelling place where in the physical world. He wanted there should be a physical world, a finite world, and we should do our spiritual job by bringing Tainug into the world. How does that happen? It doesn't happen by itself. It happens by doing our avodah of learning Torah and doing mitzvahs specifically in the world, and then we bring the infinite Hashem into the world. And just like when originally Hashem created the world, so it says in the prophets, Sheikav Amud of Sheish, in other words, that Hashem wanted, and He had a desire to create the world. Now, why did Hashem have a desire to create the world? Not that it should be a physical world, so that we should come into this world, learn Torah and do mitzvahs, and draw down godliness, the infinite part of Hashem, into the world. And the reason why Hashem desired it is because of our avodah, because of our spiritual work. And like it's brought down in many places in Kabbalah and Chassidus, that based on the verse that says, in the prophets, Im HaMelech B'mlachta, we're together with Hashem in His work. In other words, what does that mean? That when Hashem created the world, who was He envisioning? Who did He consult with? With the souls of the righteous people. What does that mean, righteous people? Anyone that learns Torah and does mitzvahs and prays in this world, this is what Hashem had dreamed of. That we should finish the job by bringing Tainug and the infinite part of Hashem into this world. And that's why specifically, when we do our spiritual work, we draw in and we reveal in the physical world that Hashem created real Tainug, real deep pleasure, which is the component of that the Saba Kadosh Baruch Hu Liyos Le'Yisbarach with the Tainug. Hashem wanted to have a dwelling place into this world. What does that mean, a dwelling place? The infinite Hashem should dwell in this world. And that's why it says, "V'karasa l'Shabbos oinig." What should you call Shabbos? Oinig, real deep pleasure. In other words, that we, by doing our avodah, we draw down into Shabbos Tainug. Which Tainug? The infinite Tainug. Up to the point where literally the physical world, the good meat you're supposed to eat on Shabbos, the wine you're supposed to drink on Shabbos, and all the other delicacies people like eating on Shabbos, the goal is to bring down God and godliness into the physical world. And that's why it says, Vayichulu Hashemayim B'aretz V'chol Tzva'am. And again, Vayichulu means, now we learned a whole new insight. Vayichulu means Tainug. The idea is to bring Tainug into the world. And just like the first human being, Adam HaRishon, he effected completion in the creation. When he stopped and he said, no, let's thank Hashem, let's prostrate ourselves, let's bless Hashem. So the same thing also, every single one of us, through our spiritual work, we could make a dwelling place for Hashem down here in this world. And just like when Hashem wanted to create the world, He looked into the Torah, and that's what He used to create the world. The Torah is the blueprint for the world. So the same thing also us. When we learn Torah, the world's created. We keep the world alive. Hashem created the world through Torah, and we keep the world alive through Torah. That we literally make new heavens and new earth. And the Rebbe quotes and he says that in the beginning of creation, what does it say? Eile toldos hashamayim va'aretz. This is the birth of the heaven and earth, Behibar, when Hashem created it. Now if you give a look, the word toldos, so toldos is spelled with two vavs. It means it's called mole, it's complete. Hashem created it complete. Hashem created a complete world. But when we do our work, then we create a second toldos, a second completion. What is that? We know it says in the prophet by Ruth. It says Eila Toilos. This is the offspring of Peretz, and over there Toilos also says with a double vav, which is higher than the initial Toilos of when Hashem created the world. So Hashem created the world was complete from the level of heaven and earth. But when we do our avoid, it becomes complete in a whole different level. When is ultimately this all going to happen? When we're going to have the redemption. The true redemption, the complete redemption, which is going to happen through Mashiach Tzidkenu. Because what's going to happen when Mashiach comes, we know, as the prophet says, Oz efay chal amim safa rura lekroi kulam b'shem Hashem la'avdei shechem echad. Everyone's going to have the clarity. Everyone's going to have the clarity to realize that Hashem is the one that created the world and maintains the world. And we're all going to serve one God. And as the prophet says, V'hoya Hashem lemelech al kol haaretz. God is going to be the king over the whole earth. By Yoim Ahu, when that day, when we finally finish our job of making this world a godly place, Yeh Hashem Echad U'Shmoyach, Hashem is going to be one, and everyone's going to call the same one Hashem. And as the prophet says, V'nigle Kvoid Hashem, Hashem is going to be totally revealed. V'ro Kol Basar Yachtav, everyone's going to see. Ki Pi Hashem Dibur, that's just one. Hashem is the one that's speaking. And what does that mean, Pi Hashem Dibur? That literally the physical flesh, not only our godly soul, but our animal soul, our physical body is going to see that it's all God. When is that going to happen? It's going to happen when B'Karev Mamish. It's a beautiful Chassidic discourse, going to change our whole perspective by Yechulu, because it shows us that we're really partners with Hashem. And by us doing our spiritual work, learning, praying, doing mitzvos, we bring the real timing in this world. We partner with Hashem, and we create the ultimate completion when everyone will realize that Hashem is the one that created the world, maintained the world, and the Rebbe says ultimately we'll all merit this to happen with Mashiach Tzidkenu. Have a great week and a blessed week. Thanks for joining us for our class on Chassidus.
Moment of Wisdom. Sub-brief and life-changing moments. Join us. Subscribe to Moment of Wisdom channels on YouTube, Telegram, Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp.